simple Google search reveals that fascism is an authoritarian, right-wing political ideology and mass movement characterized by extreme nationalism, dictatorial leadership, and the suppression of opposition. There are 7 main features of fascist regimes. Number 1 is extreme nationalism. Fascist movements promote intense national pride and belief in the superiority of their nation, often relying on propaganda to fuel blind obedience. Number 2 is dictatorial rule. Power is centralized around a single autocratic leader, leading to a cult of personality in which that leader is seen as the savior of the nation. Number 3, suppression of opposition. Fascist governments use force and violence to suppress dissent, persecute political enemies, and eliminate civil liberties. There is no tolerance for disagreement with the ruling party. Number 4 is militarism. The ideology promotes an extreme emphasis on the military and often romanticizes violence as redemptive. Number 5 is social hierarchy and elitism. Fascist ideology champions a natural social hierarchy and the rule of elites. Individual interests are subordinated to the good of the nation. Number 6 is economic regimentation. The government exerts severe control over the economy, labor, and commerce. While leaders may appeal to the working class, regimes often align with or protect powerful corporate interests. Number 7 is fear of outsiders. Fascism often exploits xenophobia and identifies enemies or scapegoats to create a sense of unity. This can lead to racial and ethnic persecution. Trump and MAGA absolutely meet this criteria. They are trampling the Constitution and crushing freedoms. Republicans in Congress and the Supreme Court have abdicated their power to Trump. Trump and MAGA have vilified and scapegoated immigrants from Latin America and Haiti. See, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. And ICE, or Trump's Gestapo, is violating people's constitutional rights while tearing families apart. And the regime is now sicking the military on the citizenry of cities led by Democrats. Trump is using the government and the Department of Justice to attack perceived political opponents and labeling citizens who dare to expect the country to aspire to the ideals laid out by the Founding Fathers, the enemies from within. Trump has incessantly attacked the mainstream media. Being owned by cowardly billionaires, they kiss the ring, making all major American media outlets peddlers of fascist propaganda. Can't be any clearer that Trump, Republicans, and MAGA are full-blown fascists, wholly committed to destroying democracy in America and abroad. Hello, my name is Benjamin Royan, and welcome to Falling for Fascism, a study of how the Republican Party descended from the party of Lincoln to the cult of Trump. Today's episode is the Southern strategy in the unification of Northern and Southern racists under the Republican banner. This strategy, launched in the 1960s, sought to attract disaffected white Southerners, who are mostly Democrats, to the Republican Party. Before I get into this, I would like to acknowledge that as a straight white man who has never been discriminated against, I can never truly understand what the oppression of racism really feels like and how it affects my day-to-day life. This is a brief overview of slavery and the birth of racism in Europe and America. This is a large and expansive topic, and of course exceptions existed to what follows, but a more detailed discussion of slavery and racism in America would require hours to cover and not minutes. I will now provide a summary of the history of slavery. Slavery existed in ancient times. While still horrible, there was a greater chance of gaining freedom, and children of slaves weren't automatically born slaves. Colonization of the New World and the need for labor to plant and harvest cash crops caused colonists to look to Africa, where a thriving slave trade already existed for this labor, because indigenous populations were being ravaged by European disease and native peoples escaped too easily. The slave trade, and a need to control the slave population that often outnumbered whites, began the association of blackness with slavery. Racism is an important step on the road to fascism and will be intertwined with future episodes that address topics such as bigotry, xenophobia, and sexism, and how they primed Republicans to become full-blown fascists. Slavery was baked into the very birth of America. First enslaved people to arrive at England's North American colonies, over 20 Africans brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Pilgrims arrived in 1620. Furthermore, racism was built into the Constitution with the 3/5 Compromise, which was an agreement at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to count enslaved peoples as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining both taxation and representation in Congress. An important aspect of racism in America was the massive fear of slave revolts, because in many Caribbean islands and areas of the South, slaves outnumbered whites. 1791 Haitian revolt stunned and horrified whites, especially in America, and especially Southern plantation owners. The revolt began on August 22nd, 1791, when revolting slaves began massacring their oppressors and their families. The violence continued until 1804, when the colony gained independence. There was an intensive control over slaves, with brutal violence and prohibitions of allowing slaves to read, and rights of freed slaves in the form of slave codes, which were a body of statutes enacted in the United States from the 1640s to the 1860s that defined enslaved people as property and severely restricted their freedoms and rights, including the ability to sell children of slaves and splitting apart married couples. Another important aspect of racism in America was the initial discrimination recent immigrants from Europe experienced, and went from not being white to fully white, and enjoying the benefits and privileges that accompanied that status in American society. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and other majority Catholic countries largely moved to northern cities where they were treated poorly and discriminated against because white Anglo-Americans thought Catholics couldn't be loyal to America and the Constitution on account of their loyalty to the Pope. Despite the poor treatment and initially not being viewed as white on account of their religion, these immigrants eventually became solidly white, even though there wasn't a Catholic president until JFK. As mentioned in my first episode, whites saw themselves as being atop the social hierarchy, and white immigrants relished the opportunity to reside in this elevated position of American society. Northern descendants of immigrants used their ascension to white to look down on blacks. Well, we face discrimination, we're able to assimilate and succeed. Why couldn't they? Is a question I've heard many future MAGAs say in the past. This point of view completely ignored, and MAGAs still ignore, how systemic racism has negatively impacted African American communities. Southern evangelical churches encouraged white supremacy and the need to Christianize slaves. Evangelical churches still do this, and most of their sermons are in direct opposition to Jesus' teachings. Following the Civil War, there was an attempt to reconstruct the South. However, those attempts fell short. Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee who was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, in a country exhausted by a civil war, never really changed the Southern society. Following the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Reconstruction Amendments, which were passed after the Civil War to grant rights to formerly enslaved people. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for Black men. Failure to enforce these amendments led to Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws mandating racial segregation in the United States from the late 19th century until 1965. These laws enforced the separation of races in public facilities, transportations, and schools, and were a form of systemic discrimination which disenfranchised Black voters. Sharecropping is another important aspect of racism in America, in which African Americans lived and farmed on lands owned by whites and provided the landowner with a large portion of their crop, which created a cycle of debt and prohibited upward movement. Campaign of terror waged by groups such as the KKK led to lynchings and other forms of violence to enforce subjugation of African Americans to maintain what they saw as the natural social order. Northern racism, while less overt, was still insidious. The Great Migration, which primarily occurred from 1910 to 1970, was an exodus of African Americans from the southern states to escape racial violence and discrimination and to seek better economic and educational opportunities in northern and western cities. Racist Northerners enacted their own policies to prevent African Americans from living too close to them or integrating too thoroughly into white society, thus challenging white privilege. One of the ways they did this is through redlining. Redlining is a discriminatory practice of denying services like mortgages, loans, and insurance to residents of certain neighborhoods, typically based on their race or ethnicity. The term originated from government maps used during the 1930s, which outlined areas deemed hazardous for investment with red lines, often because they were predominantly populated by minority groups. This practice, now illegal, has resulted in lasting economic and social inequalities in affected communities. Race riots that happened in northern and western cities are another example of this. There was a race riot in Chicago in 1919, New York, the Harlem riots, 1964, LA Watts riots, 65, and the Boston busing riots from 1974 to 76, which was pretty much 40 separate riots, are examples of the racism that existed and still does today in the North. The Southern strategy was successful in unifying racists from the North and South. Part of what helped unite Northern and Southern was eugenics, which is a pseudoscience influenced by Darwin's 1861 On the Origin of Species, which claimed a natural order with whites being superior. Hell, the current health secretary, RFK Jr., is a eugenicist. Eugenics played a prominent role in the thinking of Northern and Southern Republicans. Prior to the Southern strategy, most Southern politicians were racist Democrats. Therefore, in 1964, Barry Goldwater and other Republican strategists saw an opportunity to attract white Southern voters who opposed the Civil Rights Act, which Democrats such as LBJ advocated for. Nixon successfully combined the Northern and Southern racists in '68 by playing on fears of black crime and slowing civil rights in the South. Republicans talked about crime without acknowledging systemic racism and how it negatively affected African American communities. This is important because Northern and Southern racists were unified under the Republican banner that identified African Americans as being more prone to violence without acknowledging the racist policies that created more poverty in black neighborhoods. Around the globe, poverty and not race is more closely associated with higher crime rates. The phrase, "poverty is the worst form of violence," is attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, and it suggests that poverty is a form of violence because it deprives individuals of basic rights and dignity and forces them into desperate acts for survival and creates a cycle of deprivation and suffering. Italian and Irish gangs born in impoverished neighborhoods that engage in horrific acts of violence are a perfect example of this. For sure, advancements have been made in American society that have provided more opportunities for African Americans, but Trump, Republicans, and MAGAs, who seek to return to a mythologized version of the 1950s, are actively trying to roll back these advancements, along with the rights gained by marginalized communities and women. Trump and Republicans rely on racist tropes, such as associating African Americans with crime, to solidify their base and attract more racists to the MAGA movement, without even remotely addressing the role class plays in higher crime rates. Now I'll finish with a brief discussion of fiscal conservative. Republicans became fierce fiscal conservatives in the 1930s in their opposition to FDR and the New Deal. Fascism was born in the late 1800s as the right's answer to socialism, as it gave the working class a facade of democracy through voting blocs or syndicates that voted for representatives of their industry, but industry heads ultimately had the veto power over those representatives. Italy under Mussolini became the first fascist country in 1921. Fiscal conservatives aren't necessarily fascists, and some fiscal conservatism creates more oversight of governmental spending. But fascists and Republicans both oppose unions and workers' rights to benefit corporations. Republicans oppose social safety nets as communism. Conflating social spending and workers' rights with communism gave Republicans an enemy the majority of the country opposed. The Southern strategy unified Northern and Southern racists under one banner that fought to make the rich richer at the expense of the working class. By the late 80s, early 90s, Republicans were just understood to be the party of racists. The David Dukes, the Pat Buchanans, Strom Thurmonds of America all coalesced under the Republican banner and worked to undo the rights gained by minorities by pushing false and harmful stereotypes, while also fighting against efforts to alleviate poverty. Just check the stats. All the poorest, least educated, and most violent states are red states that have been solidly Republican for years. Republican politicians and strategists use racism to convince 66% of working class whites in the 2024 election to vote against their best interest in order to preserve their white privilege. And Republican billionaires are only too happy to use their hate to control their workforce. Racism, along with the oppression of workers, helped prime Republican politicians and voters to support a fascist as vile and immoral as Trump. Back in 2015, when Trump announced his candidacy, Trump supporters, at least here in the North, I didn't speak to any Trump supporters from the South, so I can't speak on the reasons they gave, performed great feats of mental gymnastics and made demonstrably false statements, such as he's a financial genius, to avoid openly admitting they were going to vote or voted for Trump because they are racist. A man who inherited over $400 million is not a self-made billionaire. One of the most obvious reasons he did not release his tax returns was because he wasn't a billionaire anymore at the time. Someone who bankrupted a casino, stole money from a charity for children with cancer, ran numerous fraudulent and failed businesses, and declared bankruptcy so many times that American banks would no longer issue loans to him, thus forcing him to take money from Russian gangsters, making him beholden to Putin, is clearly not a financial genius, and is in fact economically illiterate. Even after he crashed the economy in his first term because of his incompetent response to COVID and tariffs that required a bailout of farmers, MAGA still pushed this laughably false narrative. Trump was not a billionaire in his first term. He definitely is now, because he has parted his foolish supporters from their money, his crypto scam, charged the Secret Service exorbitant amounts of money to stay at his hotels, taken bribes in exchange for pardons, and other outrageously blatant corrupt acts. Foreign leaders are well aware they can extract what they want from Trump by flattering him and giving him lavish gifts. Even if MAGAs have deluded themselves into thinking Trump knows anything about economics, racism and hate is the real reason for voting for fascism. MAGAs should be aware that, even those who aren't hardcore Trumpers, if you are in a political party filled with Klansmen and neo-Nazis, and they aren't denounced and forced to leave from that party, and you don't leave it, you are officially a Ku Klux Nazi. Part of what I'm doing with this project is making sure that history remembers MAGAs as racist fascists who sought to destroy democracy in America in order to allow their Führer, Trump, to commit atrocities. Trump is already violating the Constitution by sending humans to concentration camps without due process, and is murdering people in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean in violation of international law. Thank you for joining today, and apologies for the poor production quality of the show. I'm operating with no budget, and it's solely produced by, as the MAGAs would say, a woke beta male. I encourage everyone to resist this immoral and evil regime, but to do so peacefully. We hold the moral high ground in this struggle for democracy, and resorting to violence weakens our position. If you would like to participate in future episodes or share some ideas you'd like us to cover, you can leave comments below, or you can find me in Blue Sky under the handle Chet Manley, ChetManley, or you can leave comments on my pinned post about this podcast. Everyone is welcome to join. From academic historians to amateur historians, to people who have simply lived through the time period being covered and want to share what they thought about the situation and how they saw things change afterwards. This is everyone's opportunity to preserve their understanding of how we got here. Thanks again.